All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar in the Center for Teaching and Learning. My name is Emily Spranger. I'm an academic trainer, and I am thrilled to be able to bring back to National University, Northcentral University, Harvey Bakari. Today, he will be exploring kind of a Q&A format, your questions, legacies of early African-American history. So, a couple of brief housekeeping items here that I want to cover before we dive into today's webinar. We do want you to ask us questions. So Harvey is here to answer questions, so we welcome that. Questions can be popped in the Q&A. We did already have some questions previously submitted to us before today's webinar. And then if you would like to just have a conversation in the chat, we welcome you to do that as well. As always, we're recording our webinar, and if you would like to have the CC option shown to you for subtitles, you can do that today. You just have to hover over the very bottom of your Zoom, hit the CC option and select show subtitle. So I want to kick it over to Harvey Bakari, president of Bakari Historical Services, and then just see if he wants to take some of the questions before he dives into some other material he wants to share with you today. So Harvey.
Thank you, Emily, and welcome to everyone at National University. I understand it's been a merger between Northcentral University and National University, so welcome to those who may not be familiar with me and the previous presentations that I've done for Northcentral University. Well, I am the founder of Bakari Historical Services, and I offer presentations that broaden the significance of early African-American history and culture. And I like to do that to bring about awareness and inclusion of the early African-American experience. And my vision is that history can change not just the past, but the present. And so I'm a public speaker, a public historian, museum professional, consultant, and a visual artist. And I spent 23 years as a museum professional at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation in Williamsburg, Virginia, where I worked in public history as a manager, as well as a frontline interpreter. So I'm accustomed to talking to hundreds of thousands of diverse audiences, diverse people about some of the celebratory topics, but some of the most difficult topics to address as well. And so I've had a lot of experience with engaging people with those topics of all ages, ethnicities, and races. So I have a couple of advanced questions from before this webinar. So I'm going to focus on that. But let me just explain a few things to you about some of the ground rules, if you will. When I discuss the 18th century, I do let people know that there's certain terminologies that might make people uncomfortable, some terms that are derogatory, but this is being done not to disrespect anyone, any culture, race, ethnicity, or religion. It is to reveal history, and the history that is recorded, history which you can find in many archives here in the United States and around the world. So primary documents, secondary documents are very important. And then of course, I will use some of my historic conjecture of what I believe happened in certain incidents and so forth, and some of my perspectives and opinions as well. All right, so I'm going to start with the first question. Oh, well, but let me just tell you some of the terminology I use. When I speak of white, I'll use the term white in terms of white Americans, Black Americans, or African Americans. Historically, terms that were used historically for African Americans would be Negro, mulatto. Mulatto would be a biracial person, most times of European and African ancestry, even though they can be mixed of any ancestry. But primarily that's the one that they focused on in the 18th century in Virginia. So most of my focus is going to be Virginia in the 1600s and 1700s, and then we'll look at some legacies that go into the 19th and 20th centuries. And as a matter of fact, the first question is going to kind of dovetail into what I'm talking about in terms of time period. So I just want to kind of lay that down. Another very important part of history is understanding the historical context of the time period. If you take history out of its context, people can misunderstand it and come up with conclusions that are not accurate to what occurred during the historical event. So context will be very important as well. So I'm going to move along to the first question that I received, which I thought is a very interesting question. And it's about recent history. And the question says, is there an academic definition of recent history, or is it subjective? Coming from England, most of the history of the US seems recent to me. Now, very good question, because this has to do more with perspective. What is the perspective of an experience of the audience? And in this case, this person is from England. And in England, I'm sure I can imagine this person can easily drive by or walk by buildings that extend back to the 12th century and so forth, thousands of years. Whereas the history of the United States is a little bit over 400 years. So we're relatively new compared to many European countries. So that's the first thing. So when I use the term recent, I am being subjective, as a matter of fact. And I'm being subjective in terms of the African experience in America. In this case, the African experience in British North America in 1619 to the foundation of the United States in 1776 or 1784, whichever date you use. So here, from my 23 years of experience, here is one thing that was very common. And I should remember that even the history of Africans before the slave trade, and it's important to state that on the continent of Africa, there were many, many civilizations, and they have a very extensive history that's still being studied by archaeologists, anthropologists, extending back to the Nile River Valley, Egypt, Nubia, and the Sudan, Zimbabwe. I could go on and on, the Kingdom of Kush, and so forth, as well as the West African kingdoms. So yes, recent history is subjective, but let me get to what I mean by recent history in terms of what I focus on, which is early African-American history. Recent history is what, from my 23 years of experience, what most people recognize as early African-American history. Most people will start with Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War. Now, there's a good reason for that, because it's that part of our American history. There's so many things and so many events, so many institutions, historical monuments that depending on where you live in the country, you can see those monuments and reminders, institutions connected with that time period. And so that's 400 years, the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and the 1900s. In my experience, most people compress those last 200 years, the 1800s and the 1900s, as African-American history or early African-American history. And they tend to exclude, not on purpose, it just tends to be minimized, the 1600s and the 1700s, even though today, many of the terminologies that we use derive from those time periods. It's the origin, the roots of the African-American experience. So that's what I mean when I say recent history, the 1800s, 1900s, Jim Crow, Civil Rights Movement, 1800s, obviously, Civil War. So that is but just a little more. Another thing to keep in mind when you're talking about history, I mentioned this before, and I have to apologize. I was looking for the citation to put on this particular slide, but this particular research identified what was the median arrival date of Africans and Europeans to the Americas, in this case, British North America, the United States. And obviously, Native Americans were here, according to archaeologists, for thousands of years, as well as traditional wisdom and as well, and culture as well. But we're going to focus on the African arrivals. The median arrival date for Africans here in British North America / United States would be the year 1770. That means if you took all the people who arrived from the very beginning in 1619 to the last slave ship in 1860, and you put all those numbers together, 1770 is the median arrival date for people of African descent who were enslaved. For Europeans, if you take the first settlers, permanent settlement, 1607 at Jamestown, and you go into the 19th century, the median arrival date is 1900. And that's because of the huge influx of European immigrants. It's always been a constant influx, but as you move into the 19th century, you start getting these huge influx of Europeans into the United States. So this plays a part in what a person refers to as recent history. And so from an African-American history perspective, recent history is the 1800s and the 1900s, and a de-emphasis on the 16 and 1700s. So that's the first question.
Harvey,
yes.
Before we jump into the second question that we received in before this webinar, there was a question in the chat, and I was wondering if maybe you could, if you are able to shed any information or knowledge on this topic, but do you have any insight on the 1638 Maryland Doctrine?
1638, there are so many, I'm not sure exactly which one.
Which one in reference?
They
did not specify, just any insight on the 1638 Maryland Doctrine. And Negus, if you do want to specify more, feel free to pop that in the chat. We can always come back to it.
Yeah, the only thing I could think of 1638, not in Maryland, but in Virginia, was 1638 that said that Negroes could not own firearms. That was the first time the term Negro was used in the laws of Virginia. Even before they mentioned slaves or anything of that nature, is that they could not own firearms. But I'm not quite sure what was happening in Maryland at that same time, even though Maryland and Virginia are part of the Chesapeake Bay region or Chesapeake area. So there are some similarities and differences. Both had a large enslaved population. But if they can give me a little bit more information, I might.
That's okay. We can come back to it. Thank you so much, Harvey.
Okay. You're welcome. All right. Now, the next question that was posed, I did a webinar about the Black literacy. One of the most popular beliefs. And as a matter of fact, if I can remember correctly, we did a poll for those who were attending the webinar. What percentage of them believed that it was illegal for slaves to learn how to read and write? And I think it was about 86% thought it was true that it was illegal for slaves to learn how to read and write. But I did a webinar about Black literacy to show them that that's not quite true. Again, context makes all the difference. So this person, in response to seeing that particular webinar, says, besides it being illegal for slaves to read and write, what other mass-believed myths are there about slave life in this time? That would be like the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s as well. And so I'm going to just share a few of them with you. What are some of the other myths? Well, again, just a real recap of Black literacy for those who were not a part of that particular webinar. It was not until a particular time period, it was not illegal by law for slaves to learn to read and write. It was up to their owner, because remember, an enslaved person is private property. So no one could tell the owner what they could and could not do with their private property. So if the owner wanted to teach his enslaved person how to read and write, he could do so. Just a few people in history to give you an example. You all probably know the story of Frederick Douglass being taught by his owner how to read and write. If you know the history of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, the leader, Toussaint Louverture, he was also taught to read and write as a slave before becoming a free Black and leading the Haitian Revolution. Also, if you're familiar with an African named Mulata Equiano, who was an abolitionist against the slave trade, he also was allowed to read and write. He spent most of his time on ships in the mariner industry. And he also learned how to read and write. So the owner had the right to teach their enslaved person how to read and write. But that doesn't mean that everybody was in agreement. So if anyone saw slaves reading and writing and they were not in agreement with them reading and writing, they could be punished, until a very important event that some of you may be familiar with is Nat Turner Rebellion here in Virginia in 1831, in August of 1831, a place called Southampton County. And Nat Turner led a rebellion. He was a Baptist preacher. He also, we believe he knew how to read and write. I'm not quite sure about that. I'd have to go back and see. But he was a Baptist preacher. And they killed about 60 white citizens, male, female, and children. And it terrified the country. And at that point, you start seeing laws that said specifically that it was illegal for slaves to learn to read and write. And also, eventually, they even passed laws. And I'm just speaking of Virginia right now, but it also happened in other colonies, other states. Virginia said that even free Blacks could not learn to read and write. So that's just a little background about the history of it. But again, prior to those laws being passed, anyone could stop slaves from reading and writing. They didn't need a law to prevent them. But there were also some people who did, in fact, teach their enslaved people how to read and write. Okay, so one of the first myths, African culture is just oral tradition. They don't have any written language. And during the slave trade, that was incorrect. The time of the 1500s and 1600s, because many times when people are thinking of history, they leave out, particularly here in the West, they typically leave out Islam. And when they leave out Islam, then they're leaving out the literary traditions of places like Timbuktu and Mali, as well as a tradition called Ajama. Ajama is when, let's say, someone who's from the Wolof of Senegal, they speak Wolof and they are Muslim, and they would learn the Quran, which is their holy scriptures. They would learn the Quran and traditional Arabic. It's a classical Arabic. It's not a spoken language. It's a classical Arabic. So they took the language and added their own vowels to it to create their own languages. So that's how you have books written by African scholars in places like Timbuktu and Mali. And some of those Africans were, in fact, those African priests, Marabout, they were captured and enslaved in the Americas as well. So they did bring with them their Islam and the tradition of writing in Arabic or in Ajama, which is traditional African written religion using classical Arabic script. Now, another myth, most people, again, because they think of slavery, they think of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Underground Railroad. And so they think that King Cotton is what really started slavery, but it wasn't. Before cotton, the very first crop that really opened the floodgates, because the earliest Africans brought to the Americas by the Spanish, they were mining precious minerals like gold, diamonds, and so forth, emeralds. But once Brazil plantations began growing sugar, sugar became like the oil fields of the Americas. I mean, today, if I had for you a sugar cookie, you would think nothing of it if I took that sugar cookie and threw it on the ground. You'd say, oh, they're so cheap. But in the 1500s, having a sugar cookie was a sign of extreme, well, I shouldn't say extreme, but a sign of wealth. And so only few people would have access to sugar and sugar cookies. So the price of sugar was very high, and using labor from enslaved Africans is what opened the floodgates to the transatlantic slave trade. And then in Virginia, in the colonies, as you see behind me, you see the tobacco. Tobacco was going to be the leading crop before cotton in the 19th century. Let's take a look at another example of a myth. One myth is that Africans were these, and particularly from that time period, you can understand at that time period, the slave traders and people involved in the slave trade, for them, it was a respectable business Okay, they didn't see any conflict of humanity with this idea of transferring Africans to the Americas in slave ships. At that point, slavery was something that was normative, if you will. And so when they explain and rationalize the enslavement of Africans, they said they were uncivilized and barbaric, animal-like. But the truth of the matter was they were capturing these Africans because of the skills that they had. And the European slavers needed these skills in the Americas, agricultural skills, rice growing in the South Carolina and the Low Country, South Carolina and Georgia, textiles, gold mining. If one was a goldsmith or a silversmith, that particular African would be a higher price. So the slave traders and the buyers, they knew the skills, and they were specific. The slave traders began to know which region of the country wanted Africans who knew how to grow rice. They had special orders for African blacksmiths, goldsmiths, woodworking, animal husbandry. Some of the Africans for Ghana were used in the horse racing industry very early on. Domestic skills for Africans who came from urban areas. Fishery skills that would be used in the maritime industry, particularly here in the Chesapeake, Maryland, and Virginia. Some early oyster business and so forth. Also, there was foodways, those skills, medicine. There was an African here in Virginia. His name was Pawpaw, and he came up with a cure for a type of venereal disease. And Governor Gooch of Virginia freed him, but kept him, if you will, under consignment. He said, "You're free, but any other concoction you come up with will be the property of the colony of Virginia." So again, using medical skills that are coming from West Africa, architectural skills as well, and the ability to do navigations along the coast and the ocean. All those maritime skills would be used by the European slavers. So this idea of, and the stereotype of these savage Africans, you know, like the classical old cartoons, swinging on vines, all that stuff, that would be a lot of money and a lot of investment to put in to go to a continent, capture dumb, unskilled people, and bring them to a country to build its wealth and power. The slavers knew exactly what they were doing. The buyers knew exactly what they were buying. And so that's another myth about the Africans who were brought here to the Americas. Another one, I could go on, but just a few. Were all Africans that were enslaved in the Americas, were they all made into slaves? And the answer to that would be no. There were many of them who rebelled. As you look on this map, and this time I'm looking at the Americas, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the French, all had different territories in the Americas. And you have very early on, if you start at the bottom in Brazil, you see the Quilombos. You also see the Suriname, the Maroons. Now, Maroons mean these Africans ran away from the plantations, went to, most cases, isolated territories like mountains, places that were very difficult to get to, and would give them military advantage to fight off any attempt to re-enslave them. So they would find a place where they could protect their independence. So you have those Maroons in Suriname. You've got the Palenque in Colombia, the Zambos, as well as in Jamaica, the Maroons of Jamaica, who signed, the British had to sign a treaty with them in 1738. You also have those in St. Vincent. You had the Black Seminoles in the 19th century. You had the Dismal Swamps here between Virginia and North Carolina. And of course, the second, and in Florida, Fort Mose, where that was one place that slaves in the British territories would run to the Spanish territory and run to Fort Mose, convert to Catholicism, and be freed and help defend that territory for the Spanish. And then, of course, you have Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, the second republic in the Western Hemisphere. Many of those Africans were also supported by Maroons who and as well as many of the Africans that were brought over, again, going back to skills, and we're going to touch on this in a second. Many of the Africans who brought over had military experience. They just happened to have lost the conflict. That's why they ended up being slaves as prisoners of war, but they still had military experience. And one of the theories that historians have about the Haitian Revolution is that the Africans were using their African military experience and strategies to defeat the French, the Spanish, and the British, and establish in 1804 the Second Republic in the Western Hemisphere, and a Black Republic by slaves and free Blacks. People tend to forget the free Blacks involved in the Haitian Revolution. Now, another myth, and this kind of dovetails off of what I just talked about. Sometimes people will say, for various reasons, that we're a nation of immigrants. Now, obviously, we know Native Americans are not immigrants. They were here thousands of years before European settlers arrived. But people would also say that about Africans, but I'm saying no, at no point have I seen so far consistent documentation, primary documents where Africans were referred to as immigrants. Because to be an immigrant means that you are a person and you have the ability to come to a country. Africans were captured and most of them were prisoners of warfare. So that brings us to this question, again, getting back to maybe it's not so much a myth, but it's semantics. It could mean something to you and maybe it doesn't, but here it is. Were most African kidnapped? If you're old enough to have watched Roots, you would know Kunta Kinte was kidnapped. And so you constantly hear this narrative that Africans were kidnapped, but were they kidnapped or were they prisoners of war? Now, the truthful answer is they were both, but it suggests from most research that the majority were prisoners of warfare. It would just cost too much time and effort to kidnap individually 500 people to put on a ship, plan to have 500 captives versus attacking a community, a village, and taking the spoils of the prisoners and putting that large group of prisoners on a ship. So most of the historical documentations, historians believe that the majority of African captives were prisoners of warfare. And one person who agreed with it is Thomas Jefferson himself. In the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, they took it out, but he said that the speaking of King George III, as they're making their point that they should seek separation from Great Britain, he said he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred of life and liberty and the persons of a distant people who have never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery, and the warfare of the Christian king, and those were his large caps, Christian king of Great Britain. And so, as you can see, he's speaking of warfare, not kidnap, but warfare. So that makes a difference. The Africans were not immigrants. They were predominantly prisoners of war. There were others who were kidnapped, and there were a few other ways that people were captured, but those are the two main ways that people were captured and enslaved in the Americas. So at no time have I seen, and maybe I haven't seen everything, where there's been regularly referred to Africans as immigrants. They were always the other, the foreigner, the outside, because basically the foreigner and slavery historically goes together in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases.
And
all right,
Harvey,
yes.
I'm so glad that you did that slide there with the prisoner of warfare, just because in the chat, someone just mentioned that trafficking and trade are not synonymous, that Africans were trafficked, not traded. And it just brings up an interesting question, because oftentimes when we look at history, they say traded slaves. But I mean, that's not what really happened though, right? I mean, is that the terminology you would use historically speaking?
Okay, now I'm trying not to get too deep into the woods, but
okay.
it's really a matter of semantics. It's a little bit of both.
Okay.
Essentially, once one ethnic group attacks another group and they take them as prisoners, they take those prisoners and they sell them or trade them to the European slavers.
Okay.
The European slavers then, after they have enough of the African captives, then traffics them to the Americas.
Okay.
So there is a process. Um, as a matter of fact, you have some Africans who were also the enslavers, obviously, because Europeans couldn't, in the 1700s, they couldn't just go into Africa and take Africans. They had to either through partnership, there were sometimes like the Portuguese, they were pretty aggressive, they went in, but most time it was through partnership with the various African leaders that that this trade would come about. And if I had more time, I would go into it, but there's a whole history of how that trade was set up. There's not bribery. Women were involved in the slave trade as well. There's a book called Daughters of the Trade.
Okay.
There's another book, I think it's called not Slaves Without Masters. I can't, maybe his title, the author's name will come back to me as well. But there was a tradition of marrying a particular, I'll tell you, as a matter of fact, when I was in Senegal, I spent about 2 weeks on Cape Gorée Island, which is one of the major trading ports in Senegal. There were others in St. Louis and so forth. But in terms of World Heritage Site, one that's well known, it's Gorée Island. And I stayed on the island for about 2 weeks. And on that particular island, when the French would come on, the French governor would come to the island, he would marry one of the African women. Many times she would be a mulatto who would previously mix with the French. And they would have this symbolic marriage. And there would be this business that would occur between her family and the European, or this case, French governor. And this is something that happened in Ghana and in other regions as well. Similar to what happened with Native Americans, where Europeans would sometimes, you marry into the business of trade. So you marry the daughter of a leader, and then you have access that other people wouldn't have. So that was not only occurring on the continent of Africa, it was occurring on the continent in the Americas as well with Native Americans. So hopefully, yeah, it's a little bit of both. It's a process.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that, because when someone popped that in the chat, it made me think of that. I was like, no, this is trafficking. This is taking people places and bringing them places they don't want to be. But I can see how you mentioned gathering and then trading and then trafficking to the Americas. Thank you for diving into that. I know it probably could be an entirely different webinar, so let's move forward.
Okay. Now, the next myth, did any Africans return? As a matter of fact, when I was in Senegal, as well as in Ghana, Cape Coast Castle, Elmina Castle, symbolically, there's a door in which the Africans, when they were being loaded onto the slave ships, they would after holding the women in one particular region and the men in a different region of the dungeons, they would then bring them through this one particular door, and symbolically that door is called the door of no return, because if you left through those doorways, you are not coming back to the continent of Africa. Now, one thing I'll say real quick, not every African who was captured was trafficked to the Americas. Some of them remain at the castles or forts along the west coast of Africa, all the way from Senegal to Angola. It's about, I believe, a couple of hundred. They were called castle slaves, and they were used to operate the castle. Sometimes they were operating the cannons and so forth, because the Europeans were constantly fighting back and forth. If an African woman was impregnated by one of the Europeans, particularly in Ghana, it's what we were told by the tour guide and historians, those women would not also be trafficked to the Americas as well. But for that door of no return, for the people who went through, for the vast majority, about 99.9%, they were not coming back. But there were a few examples of a few people. I'll just point them out. I won't go into much detail. But Abdul, and again, you'll notice something, you'll notice a strong theme here. Abdullah Rahman, he was captured, he was a Muslim, and he was able to return, well, not so much to his country, he returned to Liberia, which was a 19th century settlement for free Blacks and others. Many Northerners thought that would be a solution to slavery, is to send free Blacks, if you were going to free your slaves, send them to Liberia. His story was pretty tragic if you're familiar with his story. Then you see that the left corner, I'm doing backwards. The left corner, you see Omar Ibn Said. He decided to stay in the United States, North Carolina, I believe in the Carolinas. He decided to stay because many of these African Muslims were captured during jihads. There would be, again, warfare, jihads between various Muslim groups, and the losers, the prisoners, would be taken, sold, and trafficked to the Americas. He became a Presbyterian, but he didn't want to go back because the slave trade was still actively going on. So he decided to stay. Another person who decided to stay was Yoruba Mawat Yaramat. He actually had a house in Washington, D.C. He had a place named after him. There's a book written about him as well. I haven't read the book yet, but he also stayed. He didn't go back to West Africa. Then you see Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. Ayuba Suleiman Diallo was also a Muslim from Senegal. Now, he was able to return. He was on a plantation in Maryland. He ran away. He was captured, and they saw him scribbling on the wall. And they didn't know what he was scribbling because, of course, Africans are savages and don't know how to read and write. So what is he doing? But eventually they found out he was writing in Arabic along the prison wall, and people became kind of fascinated with him. Eventually, he was able to return back to his home country. A long story, but he did return. And then the last is Prince William Anansa Seseruku from Ghana. He was a prince, and his father did something that was very common when the Europeans and African traders were establishing diplomatic relationships. And I know you might say it's the slave trade, but again, remember at that point, it was considered a respectable business. But as part of this diplomatic relationship, these African traders, kings and so forth, would send their sons to Europe to be educated. Now, one of the reasons they're going to educate them is not to become scholars at Oxford, but to be able to understand the European system of trading and to make sure that the Europeans weren't cheating them out of their money. So a lot of times it was really accounting that they were going to learn in many cases in Europe during their education. Well, William Seseruku, he was on a ship, he was on a slave ship, because he couldn't just take a ship to Europe. He had to get on a slave ship, and that ship, when it goes to England, he would get off the ship and he would receive his education. But when the ship stopped in Barbados, he, during his transfer, if you will, as he's going from one ship to another, he got onto the wrong vessel and he was enslaved. His father got word that his son never made it to Europe. He let the European trading partners know, if you do not return my son, you will not be any more business with you. European trading partners went to Barbados. They found William Seseruku. They put him on a ship, sent him to Europe to become educated, and then made sure he went back to Ghana with his father with that education. And I believe, if I remember correctly, he was involved in doing some of the bookkeeping or accounting at Cape Coast Castle. So some of the documents that are in the British archives may have been some of the documents written by William Seseruku. So those are just some of the oh, and the very last one. This one, because I recently did a webinar, a podcast for Juneteenth. And with this one, this is where people get tripped up, and they'll get tripped up over it all the time. Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment, which one ended slavery? Now, many people, again, think of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, and they think, oh, it's the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery. It did not. It was a military measure. What ended slavery in the United States is the radical Republicans in Congress in 1865, when they ratified, not passed, but ratified the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery in the United States. So again, so when Juneteenth comes around and people are saying Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, it did not free the slaves. It was the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Is there any, let me see, before I go to the next one, I'm going to see if Emily, if you've found any other
Yes,
questions?
yes, a few other questions before we move on. Someone just mentioned, let me see, let me scroll up first. Let me ask you about, I know we touched on the liberation of Haiti, correct?
Yes.
Is there any way you can discuss, if you know, how Francois MacDonald, oh my gosh, I said that last name wrong, Macandal.
McIndown.
Thank you so much. I knew I said
Mhm.
that wrong. How was he instrumental in the liberation of Haiti? Are you
You
familiar?
have the Haitian Revolution, if anyone's being honest with you, it's a very difficult revolution to explain if you're going to explain it correctly.
Okay.
Most people would just simply say, oh, the slaves overthrew their masters and created the first republic in the Western Hemisphere, the second republic in the Western Hemisphere. That's a real abbreviated version, and it leaves out some important people and some important actors. During the revolution, there were competing camps amongst the Haitians themselves, or the Africans themselves. They weren't Haitian yet, it was Saint-Domingue. And they were competing groups about how this revolution was going to be carried out. Macandal was part of the the movement of the enslaved people. But before the enslaved people made a move, it was the free blacks. And there was a man named Vincent, who was punished for trying to stand up for the free blacks of Saint-Domingue. He was drawn and quartered publicly. And then one can suggest after that, it motivated the enslaved community like McIndow and the others to actually take action and to fight for a revolution. Again, many of those were soldiers, had African military fighting experience. And at the time of the revolution, I'll just say this real quick, that Toussaint Louverture, he's kind of like the centerpiece for the Haitian Revolution. He was a free black. He had been born a slave. He had been freed by his owner who taught him how to read and write. He was a property owner. He was a free black, and he really was not engaged with the revolution at the beginning. And he eventually became a leader in the revolution. So he wasn't on board at the beginning, but free blacks played an important role in many revolutionary movements, whether it's the Haitian Revolution, other revolutions, like in Barbados, there's Bussa. Bussa was a free black. Many of you may not be familiar. But my whole point is that free blacks became, because of people like Toussaint Louverture and the other free blacks who were involved in these movements, it influenced in the United States many of the laws, historians believe, which became more restrictive, because not only did they fear slaves in the slave rebellion, but they saw by looking at Haiti that they also were suspicious of free blacks. So people tend to leave that part out. But yeah, it's a very complicated, I really don't have the time, but it involves the poor whites, the middling whites, the Creole whites, the free blacks, the slaves. It's just this whole orchestra of events that happened and resulting in the Haitian Revolution.
Well, thank you so much, Harvey. I know there's a few more points we want to go through. There's one more question that I wanted.
Yes, let's go with the questions.
Okay, great. All right, wonderful. So let me see here. I'm scrolling up, and it's in reference to how we started to kind of dive into that doctrine piece. So I know you mentioned the 1638 doctrine for Maryland. You weren't entirely sure. I asked Negus to expand a little bit more, and the further explanation was the denial of Africans to ever obtain the fruits of white society. Is there any more insight in terms of doctrinations that you could share from your experience or your knowledge about that?
Yes, I don't have the slide with me, so I can't quote it verbatim.
Okay. Okay.
But in Virginia, one of the governors said pretty much the same thing. But before I tell you what the governor said, I like people to keep in mind, because this is also a mistake that many people make when they compress history. When I worked at Colonial Williamsburg, you'd have people, particularly white Americans, they walk into a building and they think, oh, this is how my ancestors lived. Look at this beautiful architecture and these beautiful cups and look at the silverware. And boy, my ancestors really lived great. And what people really don't understand is that what you're seeing when you walk into those nice homes and houses is about 2% of the population. And they had a lot of resentment. It was a class oriented. They had, and this part of the European tradition, you know, when you have kings, lords, and so forth, that kind of caste system. And at the bottom were what Virginia would call the lesser sorts. And that would be the poor whites. That would be the majority of the population. So for most people walking in there, the ancestors probably would not have been living in those type of buildings, drinking with tea. More than likely, they would be in a dirt, a cabin with a dirt floor. Now, that being said, I'm just trying to set up the context to understand that the hierarchy, the aristocracies, they really look down upon people who are not like them. And they really look down upon whites who were not of the better sort. So you can imagine if they look down upon the majority of whites who were not the better sorts, but who are indeed the lesser sorts, then you have to imagine how much further they look down on people of African descent, whether free blacks or slaves. And so in Virginia, there's a similar statement by a governor who pretty much said, I think it was Governor Spotswood, who said that, and he used this term, today we talk about branding, you know, you want to brand your company and so forth. He used this term back in the 1700s. He said, we must brand the Negro as, no, the free Negro as inferior, never to obtain the privilege of being white. So he's using terms that you may hear people use today. He's brand, privilege of whiteness, but he's using that in the 1700s because again, it's a very strict hierarchy of where everybody, white and black, is born into their station in life. And if you just happen to be lucky enough to be born amongst the 2%, oh, well, that's great. But if you're amongst the lesser sort, amongst the white population, if you're Native American, or if you were obviously free black or enslaved, they're really looking down even further and saying, there's no way that you have anything, no matter what you do, you will never have this privilege. And so he was talking about, we, from 1700s, we need to just mark it, brand it. They will never have it. So it's very similar to what you just mentioned.
Absolutely. And it's also, it's just very sad. I'm looking for, especially that, I don't know, it really blows my mind sometimes learning from you, Harvey.
Yeah.
Let me see here. There's just a few other just comments, people sharing some resources in the chat as well. Right now, that's it in terms of questions. So if we want to do one more section, I know that we have more material to cover, but I think we have about, what do we have, 10 more minutes or so?
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Let me know if anything comes up in between. I can stop.
Absolutely.
All right, next, one of the questions I posed was, the next question, I'm sorry. The last question was, someone was asking this question about punishment. Why were the laws around stealing slaves so harsh? I recently heard that the punishment for stealing and enslaved people was death in Georgia, more severe than the punishment for something like manslaughter. Well, the answer to that is pretty straightforward. Sometimes people, again, it's semantics. People say slaves were property, but they were more like your capital investment. So imagine someone, you've got your capital investment, you've got your 401k, you've got some stocks and bonds. Slaves were at times used as mortgages. At times they were used as collateral. So even if you had one slave, you can borrow against him or her to acquire more slaves in our property. So the monetary value of a slave was tremendous. Now, again, looking at the British history, particularly the history of monarchies, of kings and queens, church and state, that 2% of the population had most of those fine objects. And so the lesser sort, if they stole any of those fine objects, could be executed. And that was a tradition back in Europe. and it was brought over to the colonies as well. So stealing someone's slave was that was serious. You just that was just really bad, because again it was a part of people's. The slave was considered other slaves and Indians, as you see in this quote, for the better government of Negroes, mulattoes, Indians, bond or free. But let's look at what punishment in Virginia could slaves also receive the death penalty. And the first one is consulting, advising, and a conspiracy. In the same law, manslaughter, or the breaking in and entering a house and stealing. There was one particular slave in Williamsburg, he stole some turkeys from the governor's palace and he was executed. There was another who stole pigs and he was executed. So they took the theft of property very seriously. And another means of the death penalty in Virginia in 1705 would have been to administer medicine. Now, the exception was Paw, who I mentioned earlier, because he came up with a cure for venereal disease and people needed that. And they gave him an exception. But there was a fear of poisoning because many of the colonists in Virginia, I'm sure they had friends and relatives in the Caribbean and places like Barbados and Jamaica, where many slaves were using poison to kill their masters. And so there was a tradition of making the slave eat the food first before consuming it to ensure that the food was safe. There was also a case in Williamsburg, a couple of cases I could tell you about poisoning. Okay, you're probably going to hear a big boom of lightning in just a moment. Okay.
I did let them know that there are some thunderstorms near you for dramatic effect.
All right, so I'm going to, now that we just have a few minutes left.
We do have about 7 minutes, but I do have a few questions that popped up in the Q&A.
Okay, great.
So which would you like to do?
Let me handle the questions.
Yes, sir. We have, okay, so what kind of presentations do you do on the origins of African history, where Africans are centered as the original humans or original creators of civilization is one of the questions.
Because of the nature of the time restraints in most of the presentations, and if I were talking about a particular topic, I will address that.
Okay.
But I don't have one right now that specifically focus on that, because I'm trying to get to the interruption, if you will, into African history. And what I mean by interruption is, yes, the cradle of civilization, geneticists all agree, most agree that Homo sapiens through DNA was established on the continent of Africa and then spread out from Africa. So you have the DNA evidence of that. But I focus on the injury, what happened during the slave trade, because most of the history of people of African descent is the history without slavery. Slavery is about 400 years of thousands of years of history. I think some say Homo sapiens that we're somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years old. So most of the history is not one of slavery, but slavery is the injury for which many people will have questions about now. So sometimes, I kind of struggle with that topic because how much of it is relative? Now, it could be relative for being inspirational and saying that, hey, without slavery, without being under the yoke of oppression, look at the tremendous amount of civilizations and diversity of African people, what they're able to do on their own, as well as in collaboration, trading with other people, and look at the beginning of sciences and so forth that you find. I mean, I could keep going on and on. I think it's very inspirational, but the question then becomes, okay, now, but how is that relative to dealing with the injury that has occurred from slavery, Jim Crow, and all of those type of oppressive forces? How can one as W.E.B. Du Bois said, that I think he said the Negro is dealing with the color line and the double consciousness. So I guess the question is, how can you get back to a single consciousness? Because when Africans were not enslaved, when they were before colonialism and the slave trade, they did not have to be conscious of being enslaved by anyone other than their neighbors. They did not have to be conscious of being put at the bottom of the social order, if you will. So yes, I do bring it in to, particularly if I'm trying to motivate young people, I will bring that in and give them, examples of Timbuktu, some of the things that was happening in East Africa, some of the traditions and the culture and the science and the architecture that became part of building the Americas. Again, one of my main focus is not looking at Africans as just simply victims, because it's complicated. It was victims of being enslaved and trafficked, but having to find something out of nothing, which is a name of one of the exhibits in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. This idea of creating something out of nothing. One of the best examples I'll give you is, like, before hip hop, there was no hip hop. That group of people had to create something out of nothing. Before there was jazz, there was no jazz. And you can go down the line on and on and on. But I'll stop at that point because it's a good question.
It is. And it might be like, it might also be just like, I appreciate you bringing it up, Gerald, because of course, it would be an entirely different presentation, but I think valid question.
Yes, very good question.
Couple of other questions that have actually popped up here.
Okay.
Oh, Gerald just says, in response to what you're saying, in response, it is relative because it was negated. It was more than inspirational. There were psychological benefits that counter the stain of the 400 years of attack. And so I just thank you, Gerald, for your comments and for your questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Another question here about maybe when was Christianity introduced to Africa? Do you have any insight on when that happened and by whom, maybe?
Yes, I don't have all the details. I would need my notes, but I would refer you to Henry Louis Gates. He did a series on the wonders of Africa. And Ethiopia was actually a Christian country before the West was actually, before Christianity became an official religion in the West. The early Christians were persecuted. And, but it did find a home in Ethiopia. As a matter of fact, Ethiopians and their Christian churches, the Coptic Christians, believe that they have the Ark of the Covenant in their possession as well. So you have Christianity very early in Africa before the slave trade began. And I'll say this real quick. Also, the Christian missionaries went to Angola at about the same time the slave trade began. So you had Africans who were Christians in Angola who had Christian names. And despite being Christians, they were captured and enslaved in the Americas as well.
Okay.
Again, that's a whole story in itself.
And then another question here. We actually have a few more, and I know we're at the hour mark. Is it okay, Harvey, with you if we do these last two questions that I see in the Q&A? Okay. Just a question about the oldest church in isn't the oldest Christian church in Africa? Question mark.
I know the ones that are, because also you have St. Augustine, who's from North Africa. The monasteries were in that region of North Africa. I think Ethiopia as well, in the mountains. Again, I'd have to go back to my notes to be more specific about it. Okay,
that's fair. Yeah, that's totally fair. I know you remember a lot of dates and times, but I guess that is fair to have your notes with you for that question. And then just what are your thoughts on the enslavement of Africans contributing to the growth of Western civilization?
It's something that has been overlooked for a long period of time. I have a friend, he's a historian, his name is James Walton. He's from the UK. And he told me that when he began writing about the history of slavery, his contemporaries laughed at him because he said, the history of slavery is so vast. He said the influence it had on building Europe, the wealth of Europe. And he said most of his scholars, his contemporary scholars, they just laughed at him because most of the information was either suppressed or it was not looked at. But years later, he gets the last laugh. As a matter of fact, one of the slides I had shows you that let me put it this way, when you go to Europe, if you go to the UK, and I haven't been to the UK yet, but there's a tour you can take, a self-guided tour you can take in London. And that self-guided tour will tell you exactly which particular businesses, insurance companies, banks, and other establishments were built on the wealth of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, this is as well as the labor of slaves, particularly in the Caribbean islands, growing sugar. Sugar made some men wealthier than the king. They could get seats in parliament. It was just, again, my comparison would be having oil field. If you own a sugar plantation, it was the equivalent of owning an oil field. And so there's a lot of documentation about the wealth that's been created from the slave trade in the Americas as well as in Europe. Tremendous amount.
And thank you so much for that, Harvey. And I know that because we are at the hour, I do see you have some slides prepared for a question and answer piece behind you. I hope sometime you will come back and present again, and maybe we can start off where we left off, is my hope. I know that some folks have asked if they could come back and watch this session at their convenience. How can they do that? You will be able to see this recording in our CTL Webinars LibGuide page. We also will have this on our YouTube channel as well too. Someone did want to say thank you so much, Mr. Bakari, for your wealth of information. I appreciate the labor of education and research and feel blessed to have heard from you today. And just so many other folks popping that in the chat right now, but I won't go through all of the kudos. I want to thank our audience members for coming today with a few questions, and also for whoever they were, students, staff, or faculty that submitted some of the questions previously to today's webinar. Harvey, every time you come and present, I learn something every time. And I know, as I saw in the chat, our attendees are as well too. One of the comments was, wow, I never knew that. And I'm just so grateful that you take the time to come to present in our webinar series. And I hope you will come back again sometime and we can share some more information and share knowledge.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely, Harvey.
I enjoy it. They can keep the questions coming. Maybe they can be part of the next one if we do another one.
I know, absolutely. And that would be my hope as well too. So if anybody does have any further questions, don't hesitate to email me at esprenger@nu.edu. I'm happy to take them and we can compile and take a look at what our next webinar might look like with Harvey Bakari. So yes, so many people just popped in the chat. Please do another one. Anyway,
okay.
Thank you so much for your time, Harvey. And
you're welcome.
To the attendees, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.